One of my favourite techniques when making clothes is to use a concealed zip. So this is your standard regular zip, often known if you're buying them online as a standard coil zip. So the teeth lie on the front and you have this sort of shape of pull. Now a concealed zip, sometimes known as an invisible zip, is a completely different kind of zip which you need to buy specially. So you can tell it because it has this distinctive teardrop shape on the pull, and it's also completely flat on the front. The teeth lie on the back. So it needs a completely different method of inserting it as well. So I'm going to show you that now. The foot for inserting regular zips looks a bit like this. So instead of the standard foot where the hole is in the centre, a regular zip foot has little notches taken out each side so the needle can sew to one side or the other. Now a concealed zip foot, and you don't need a special concealed zip foot to put in a concealed zip, but it does make it much easier. So it has a hole through the centre, but the secret is underneath. It has these little channels, don't know if you can see that, and a V shape in the centre, and that sits along on top of the rows of teeth and enables you to get very close to the teeth without actually sewing through them. So I'm just going to pop this on my machine now. This foot actually is a sort of combination. This is a regular zip foot that has the little chunks taken out each side, and it has the concealed zip foot shape. So it's quite a handy little tool, this one, because I can do all stages of the process with just this one foot. So I have here my fabric. So if this was, say, the back of a dress or the back of a skirt, this would be the two back sections. So I haven't joined the seam at the bottom below the zip, and I think this is the secret of this technique. I know some tutorials tell you to join the seam first, but I don't. Then I'm going to take the zip. Now again, I think of this as the front of the zip with the flat side. So I'm putting the front side of the zip to the right side of the fabric, like so. So I can put one side here just now. Now I'm going to line up the tape at the top with the top edge of my fabric. In fact, I may drop it down. So I'm going to open the zip. I may actually drop it down a fraction, just to allow for whatever finish I'm going to put along the top. So you would have your waistband or your dress neck facing, or whatever was going on the top. So I'm going to allow my 1.5 centimetres plus maybe 2 or 3 extra centimetres, so maybe about 18 to 20 millimetres to the top of the zip pull. Now the teeth are going to lie exactly along my seam line, so I want to measure in 1.5 centimetres from my raw edge, and that's where I'm going to place the teeth. So I'm just going to do this by eye, but if I was doing this in real life I would probably measure it. And I'm just going to pin this zip in place. Okay, so that's my zip pinned in. So I'm just going to put a row of holding stitching in there just to anchor the zip to the fabric. So I've got my zip foot on. I've positioned it so the needle is going to be stitching to one side in this case the left side of the zip. So you would use your regular zip foot for this if you had two different zip feet. As I say, this is a sort of dual purpose foot. So I'm going to just do a row of anchoring stitches. So this is a regular stitch length, 2.5 millimeters. It's not going to be taken out, so there's no need to use any sort of tacking settings. I want this to be quite secure. So I'm going to start with reverse stitching. Now, because this acrylic foot is quite slippy, fabric slipped out there, I'm going to hold on to these threads at the back for the first 2 or 3 stitches, just so the machine can get a grip on the fabric. There we go. Now, I'm not going too close to the teeth at the moment, just merely anchoring the zip tape to the fabric. I'm holding this on at the bottom. Now, I'm only going as far as the zip pull itself because the foot is going to hit, so you can't go all the way to the bottom. And some reverse stitching to secure. Now, for the second stage, this is when I want to get right up close. And I want to get right in to stitch along the base of the teeth, not through the teeth themselves, because if you actually stitch through the teeth you won't be able to do your zip up, you can actually damage it. So this is when I swap to the centre hole of the foot. So I'm just checking now, my needle is going to go through the centre, and I'm just using the little screw at the back to change the position of my foot. So now I'm going to be sewing much closer right down this little channel. So I'm going to use the channel that's on the left because I want the teeth to roll to the left. And I find it helps if you actually start to pull. The top of the zip wants to roll over, so I'm starting to pull that over with my fingers, and I position the zip on top of the channel. Again, I'm pushing it slightly forward so that I can start with reverse stitching. Again, I like to help the zip by pulling it open with my fingers. Again, you can only go so far, more reversing. Then I'm going to just check that the zip will do up, because if you hit the teeth you won't be able to do the zip up, so there's no point going any further. I'm just going to check for how close that is. So that's pretty close, I'm happy with that. Now for the second side. This is where it can get tricky. Quite often this is where people get things upside down and back to front and twisted. So I'll show you a little process to go through to make sure you don't. First of all, we're going to do the zip up. So again, we have the front of the zip against the face of the fabric. the right side of the fabric. I'm going to take my second piece of fabric and place it right sides down. So we have fabric right sides together, top edges matching. This also ensures that you don't get that step effect where it's uneven at the top. Then if you pull back the zip, place the fabric edge against it. That's how we're going to sew these together. So I always think of this zip tape as the seam allowance of the fabric. So the zip tape goes towards the seam allowance, the teeth are pointing in towards the garment. And when I go through that process, I never get the zip twisted. So if I undo the zip, I'll show you some of the pitfalls. Sometimes you may want to go with temptation to put the teeth that way, or sew the zip onto the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to pin the second side of the zip to my fabric. Again, if you aren't sure where 1.5 centimetres or 15 millimetres is, then you can chalk your seam line onto your fabric. Usually I would neaten my raw edges first with my overlocker. And I would usually use a 5 millimetre wide stitch, so usually the zip is about 1 centimetre wide, so 5 millimetres plus 1 centimetre, there's your 15 millimetres. So by placing the edge of the zip right up against the overlocking, it's fairly easy to get it into place. Because there's one thing sure to give you wrinkles and puckers in a concealed zip, and that's not getting your seam allowance straight. Right, there we go. So I'm now going to swap the foot to the right hand side, and a tip when you've changed the presser foot, and particularly when you're working with these sliding feet, just check before you go in with the full power, just check your needle isn't going to hit the foot. There we go. So now again I'm just going to do my anchoring row, so anywhere on the zip tape to secure the zip to the fabric. So we'll start with some reverse. Removing the pins as you go. And reverse at the bottom. Zip now secured to fabric, so I can again move my foot back to the centre, check that again the needle is penetrating through the centre of the foot. Now I'm going back to the second side. This time I want to place the foot over the zip on using the right hand channel. So I can point that out. There it is. There's the right one, there's the left one, the little V in the centre. So again, rolling it round with my finger, positioning the foot onto the zip tape, starting with some reverse, and needle will run right down that channel. So once you've got the foot positioned onto the zip, I'm not going to say it's impossible to go off, but it's fairly difficult because it's like a train on the tracks. So once it's sitting on the track, again, the foot is encouraging the zip tape to roll to one side, letting you stitch down in the little cavity below the teeth. Again, we can only go down to the pull, the metal pull of the zip, and we have to stop. So I did 2 or 3 reverse stitches at the bottom there to secure my stitching. And I'm just going to check now that my zip will actually do up. And there we go. So now the final stage is to join the bottom. So I'm going to leave the zip done up this time. I'm going to take my bottom fabric edges and align them. So this is just like joining the seam. Really. So what I need to do now is join from the stitching. So the 2 rows of stitching here, the first row is the holding stitches that we put in first. The second row you see is the actual stitches fixing the zip in. So we need to join the seam coming from that row of stitches there. So we want a continuation right the way down to continue the rest of the seam. Now, so what we need to do is, again, with your zip foot, so the regular zip foot, is move it to the side so we can sew with the needle down the edge of the foot, just positioning that there. So that will let us get the needle right into that crevice. Also, what I like to do is sometimes once this is underneath and I've lined it up, I lose sight of where those stitches actually are. So if this is, if you're not able to see the stitches very clearly once it's positioned in the machine, then a little dab of a coloured chalk pencil will make it a bit more visible. I don't want to have one handy, so I'm just going to go with it. So I'm just looking to get my needle in place. Tuck this tail out the way because we don't want that to be caught into the seam. So that's the reason why you don't stitch all the way down to begin with. And hopefully, if you've done your job properly for the first section, this seam allowance, these edges should be lying on your 15mm seam line. Okay, so I'm going to put the needle in the fabric. I'm going to do some back stitching just to connect the two and continue with my seam. So right down to the bottom. So that's nicely connected there. Now on the back there's about 3mm difference, but I'm hoping that won't show too much from the front. So when you open it up, what we should get is a nice continuation straight down, and it just looks like a seam. So even with that small discrepancy, after a light press, that will be absolutely pretty good actually. So there's my finished invisible zip after a light press. So you can see it, you'd never know there's a zip in there. Pull on the fabric, you can just see but only just. I've made no attempt to match the fabric, I should say. In this case, I've not matched the pattern. But obviously if this was a proper garment, I would. One little finishing off touch, if you don't like the little tab floating about on the inside, we can just secure that to the seam allowance later, like that. And just a few stitches either side. And here, make sure you're only sewing it to the seam allowance and not all the way through. And again, make sure you do tidy up those thread ends so I don't want them getting trapped into the zip. And if you haven't already meeted your row edges, then you would do that now with your overlooker or your zigzag. So, happy sewing.